And when we are talking about modernity as a value, as a normative frame, something that we like or dislike, is at one level. The other is the historicity, the social reality called modernity, and how it is institutionalizing itself or not institutionalizing itself. I think the problems are both ways. Its institutionalization leads to some kind of restlessness amongst us because we lose our old traditional norms, but not institutionalization also creates the kind of problems that we read in our newspapers, rapes in the evening of young women who want to live a modern life in city, or corruption that we have been talking about. So its non-institutionalization is a perhaps bigger problem than its institutionalization. So I think the point that I'm trying to make is that if we move from the ideological and normative domain engaging with modernity, there is also an institutional and sociological domain, and that's where the bigger challenge lies for us. How do we understand the process of change? But development and change is something that no one would say is completely undesirable. Whatever has been the case with politics of development and change, but this is something which in a sense is part of our quote-unquote national agenda. India does want to change. India does want to become a society where there is some amount of equality, where there is institutionalization of citizenship. We have a constitution, and acceptance of constitution is something which is the starting point for our identity today. So it's not only our tradition that frames our identity, our constitution also frames our identity. Wherever I go, wherever any of us goes, we carry passports, so we are Indian. So our Indianness today is not the Indianness of the village that Gandhi was imagining. This Indianness is the Indianness of modern nation state called India, which has a constitution, and constitution has a preamble. Constitution institutionalizes or tries to institutionalize a process of democratic development and governance, and through that, then we become Indian. We feel proud of the fact that India is a very vibrant democracy. We feel ashamed of the fact that India has so many problems, right? So our Indianness is not something that is any longer the village or the town where my grandfather lived or I was born. So that is not the Indianness we are talking about. So this is a community of nation state where India becomes a democratic country, a country which is doing well, quote unquote. And it is in that context that the questions of citizenship and democracy become very, very critical for us. This is a question that I think we should keep as open question, and that is the point about it, that when we talk about citizenship and democracy in relation to modernity, it raises many uncomfortable questions. It's not simply about speaking in English language. Democracy speaks many different languages, and often it doesn't speak in very good English. Citizenship asks for many different kinds of etiquettes. It doesn't always mean that you have nice furniture at home and you walk in a particular manner and you wear a particular kind of jacket. Citizenship asks for rights. Citizenship asks for questions of hunger. Citizenship asks for questions of quality of education and stuff like that. Question of citizenship and democracy appear in a country where modernity is taken for granted. Nobody would say that Germany is not modern enough. Germany is not where modernity has been taken up mistakenly. Marx and Weber were both from Germany, and there are many other people who were born in Germany and who kind of made German into a modern nation, etc., etc. So what is happening today after 9/11, after global crisis? What kind of inequalities the questions of democracy and citizenship raise in a context where you've had democracy for several years, where you've had experience of fascism, but also then overcoming it. You've had the division and breakdown of Berlin Wall. So Germany is a very, very interesting case study of the modern West. What we have seen in our neighborhood, not that we are not familiar with it in the Indian context, but in neighborhood in Sri Lanka, the kind of violence we saw around questions of citizenship in a sense, and complete kind of ethnic cleansing, or the so-called democracy, citizenship, modern nation states, the kind of history they have had, almost all of them in West as well. So we've all had experience of violence, and this is not something which has been an easy kind of transition. We are trying to identify our agenda for the coming decades, and how do we engage with these questions? What are the challenges for students of sociology? How can we take these ahead in form of kind of PhDs and research papers? So that is the idea.
modernity is a theme that many of us have been talking about over the last 40 years. And in that process, I believe, not just in our university, but elsewhere as well. And that process, I believe, the idea of modernity, of what is modern, has also changed. And it is no longer what it used to be in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s even. And the reason simply is that what we took as modern in those days seems very passé today. It doesn't seem quite relevant anymore because the world has changed so rapidly. So if you want to give modernity some real legs to stand on, we'll have to think differently and not get spooked by the past and, argue about issues that are relevant today and have come to the surface today, which are probably there always, but were somewhat hidden from view. In the past, it was quite all right to argue in terms of modernity when you talk about, shall we say, things like industrialization, slums, urbanization, as Professor Jyotka mentioned, motor cars and the facility of the English language and things like that. They were quite all right because we were just breaking into the so-called modern world or coming out of the traditional world, and these seemed like important markers to distinguish us in terms of what we were and what we hoped to be. But as time rolled on, we found that, well, this was not enough, because in that case, modernity is not something that we should look forward to. Who wants to be in crowded spaces? Who wants to be always, threatened by violence around the corner? Earlier, life was so much more pleasant, easy, predictable. In fact, there are certain sociologists who even argued that excellence in humankind has waned with the coming of modernity, because what was grand and glorious in our character in the past is now being subjugated by other forces over which we have very little control. I believe, however, that now that we have seen through that phase of 50s, 60s, and 70s and all the books that were written at that time, I think now it's the right moment for us to take stock of what is modernity. First and foremost, I must say that if you see modernity as a thing, then you'll probably be misled into believing all kinds of things that happen in contemporaneous times to be modern. One must make a clear distinction, and as we are talking about researchable topics, one must make a clear distinction between modernity and the contemporaneous. Whatever is happening around us today is happening today in front of our eyes at this very moment, but that does not make it modern. If modernity is to be a sociological concept, if it's to be one of those passing terms that one uses calmly as one sails down the river, that's a different matter. But if you're going to use it as a sociological concept, then you have to think deeply and ask yourself, what makes a concept sociological? Why are sociological concepts different from other kinds of terms that we use in everyday life? And one important diacritic, in my view, of what makes a concept sociological is that it is about relations between people. You think of any sociological concept, whether from kinship in anthropology, totemism, Parsons' pattern variables, Weber's idea of authority and not power, Marx's notion of capital, which is not just Mr. Moneybags sitting with all that currency under his mattress. All of these terms are terms which connote relations between people, not just kind of call out to relations between people. Modernity happens to be the one term which through all these decades has somehow escaped this scrutiny. And it is always about things and not about relations between people, which is why some of the more contemporary theorists of modernity, let us take Eisenstadt, for example, can talk about multiple modernities, because as long as you see things somewhere or the other which resemble modernity, which has some family resemblance with modernity, you can say that this is another example of modernity. And sometimes it's not just things, sometimes it's only themes. Themes like nation state, themes like world economy, themes like WTO. If you talk about any of these things, then you are in the modern vortex. And I think that if you want to really look at modernity as a sociological concept, one must be careful to keep it away from other temptations of this kind of linking it with either things or simply themes. Because things and themes make sense only when the coordinates are right. Otherwise, on their own, they can be quite misleading. Professor Jyotka mentioned Mahatma Gandhi as a modernist, and that might come to many of you as a bit of a surprise. At least to a large number of Western scholars, it'll be a huge surprise, because they like to see Gandhi as a person who was a composite of many fads. But the fact of the matter is that when Gandhi insisted on non-violence, what he was actually bringing to bear upon the Indian political system was a unity of theory and practice, but more than that, a unity of ends and means. And this unity of ends and means, by the way, is something that only democracy can establish. No other society prior to democracy was able to establish ends and means in a calm, seamless manner that we have managed to achieve in contemporary modern times. Why is this so? If you look at those who argue about the distinction between ends and means, you'll find almost all of them, right down to Max Weber, had not really tasted democracy in the fullest sense. They have seen democracy from afar, or they've not seen democracy at all, which is why ends and means, the dichotomy, makes sense. But for us in modern times, it doesn't make sense. So when Habermas was discussing the public sphere, when Habermas was discussing universality, Habermas was also looking in a very Kantian way at a transcendental point from which he could rationalize all of this. And that transcendental point escaped him because he wasn't paying attention to Gandhi. The transcendental point is in Gandhi when he talked about non-violence. That is the transcendental point around which the norms of democracy are located. If you take that away, what do you have? You just have themes. You don't have democracy as a concept. You have various themes, but not democracy. Now, why is non-violence so important? Because as Gandhi argued, non-violence is important because if I were on the other side, I would like to be persuaded by non-violent means than by violent ones. Just imagine yourself on the other side, on the losing side of an argument, and you are persuaded to accede to a particular argument, not because you're convinced, but because there is force being used against you. As Gandhi said, that if you believe in violence, you might have Swadeshi, but you'll have a violent Swadeshi, and not the Swadeshi, the kind that we want, which is basically a democratic Swadeshi. So then, if you're talking about modernity, we must be very clear not to link it up with things or with themes in isolation. They have to be seen in context. So therefore, if you look at it in context, you'll find one of the biggest contributions that modernity has made in everyday life is that of intersubjectivity. And this intersubjectivity is not of the kind that Edmund Husserl or others talked about, which was a cultivated disposition towards a study of social phenomena. But this intersubjectivity is something that is spontaneous and grows amongst us because we are in a certain context. Now, what is this intersubjectivity all about? It is when you and I can trade places quite calmly without actually experiencing a schism in the soul. That is what intersubjectivity is. When your life and my life have a lot in common, and there are some differences, of course, but that element of commonness is very central because that is the ground on which we all stand. Of course, nobody is right all the time. We make mistakes. But the fact of the matter is that as we make mistakes, we can understand why these mistakes are being made. We can identify with mistakes as much as we can identify with the positive side of our everyday life. Now, this kind of intersubjectivity is something that can happen only spontaneously in modernity. Why? Because of the notion of citizenship. Now, let me tell you one thing, from my point of view, and I have done some amount of study in primitive societies, quote unquote, and modern societies and traditional societies, and I've come to this very unhappy conclusion, but it's a useful conclusion, I think, that human beings are not basically good, unlike what Rousseau said. I think human beings become good, better, and best with the coming of democracy. And that is because democracy enjoins upon human beings to lead a certain kind of life in partnership with others. So when Rawls talked about citizenship, what he mentioned, prior to actually building upon the topic, he said we should be able to share one another's fate. When you share one another's fate, you don't do it as if you were an altruistic individual, but you do it because that is the compulsion of your daily life. And this is where Marshall was a great, I think, proponent of modernity when he argued that citizenship actually confers a status of equality, the bedrock, upon which structures of inequality can be built. But that bedrock of equality of status is what allows us to think in modern terms, to think as citizens, to think in terms of intersubjectivity, where we can trade places and we can respect the other, though you do not know the other person. In tradition, even in India till very recently, nobody went to a friend's house in a village for a cup of tea. You went to your uncles, aunts, cousins' home for tea, or for lunch or for whatever. Now, increasingly in village India, I've noticed that friendships have emerged, and friendships are pretty strong and durable. In fact, friends call to other friends in terms of the rural-urban network, taking them away from some village in East UP to some place in Surat, Vapi, Mumbai, or wherever. It is not always the kinship network that works. The friendship network is also quite active. And this is something which is very, very new. Now, what is happening, therefore, in modernity is that new kinds of relationships are developing, which are not dependent upon primordial ties or upon traditional notions of who we should know and who we should not. Who are people who are worthy of association and who are not worthy of association, because at the base we are by and large the same, and this tradability, intersubjectivity is, in my view, the most important aspect of modernity. And if you don't get this right, then we will be constantly wondering whether the modernity is good or modernity is bad. Modernity, by the way, is not a finished product. So often when I wrote this book, Mistaken Modernity, I was criticized by some who I think read the book very quickly as bedtime reading, which is not exactly bedtime reading, but they saw it as that. And they came to the conclusion that I was saying that some societies are modern and some are not modern. In my view, modernity will always remain a project. The moment you think that you've achieved it and you're modern, something else will come up and you find that no, you're not quite modern, to go even further. Imagine democracy again. Democracies in the mid-19th century or even the early 20th century didn't really pay too much attention to civil rights. And they never thought that they were not democratic. They didn't pay too much attention to women's rights. In fact, when the 1919 bill was passed in England, they gave men above the age of 21 the right to vote and women above the age of 30 the right to vote, and they didn't see a problem in that at all. So democracy too evolved with time. And the evolution of democracy is somewhat synchronous with the evolution of modernity. The two do go hand in hand, do go apace up to a certain point, because one depends upon the other very, very centrally. Now, if you think of modernity, and the point that was made earlier about sociology, again you see the overlap. You cannot do sociology in a non-modern society, but I'll take it even further. You cannot do sociology meaningfully in a non-democratic environment, because the themes of sociology are themes that call out to democracy very, very intimately. And therefore, if you do sociology in a non-democratic environment, you'll find that kind of sociology doesn't really resonate with the kind of international or universal concepts with which we wrestle on a daily basis. Why is that so? Think of Parsons, for example. You'll find the notion of the other very, very important there. In the pattern variables or in whatever aspect of health or education, the other is important. And you think of all the sociologists down history, you find the other is very important, and the other becomes important because democracy is important. Till the time of Kant, the other wasn't so important. It was the self that was important. Understanding the self, the problems of the self, those things were more important. From Hegel onwards, the other became important, and this is why I think sociology depends upon the democratic foundations without which it cannot really prosper. This project of modernity is, as I told you earlier, a moving project. So some societies are modern, some are more modern, some are less modern, but if you were to look at the criteria of modernity, I would put the following criteria. One is, of course, universality. It's absolutely important. Dignity of the individual, absolutely important. But what is equally important is that you and I should be able to judge each other on criteria which are universal and transparent in character. Because modernity is not something that is hidden and that is carried out individually or between neighbors. It is a social phenomenon. So transparency and the ability to objectively verify what others are doing and evaluate yourself and others on the same scale, these are some of the important criteria, I believe, of modernity, and sometimes these are not paid attention to. Ethical anonymity. Look at that. I don't know the other person. I've never met the other person. I don't know the person's background at all. And yet, if you go by Marshall, you will have to acknowledge that other person whom you don't know at all has a certain degree of integrity, deserves a certain kind of respect, and that later on you can build friendships or not build friendships, but that basic respect must be given even though the other person is completely anonymous. The ability to confer ethical anonymity is again a very important aspect of modernity. So if you were to study modernity, I think you can easily think of certain criteria, certain attributes, variables even, which will demonstrate the extent of modernity or the lack of it. But to say that any society is completely modern, has arrived, finished, end of story, is incorrect. I think we're all moving in a certain direction, and those of us who move with the tide effectively, knowingly, will get to get some distance much further and much faster than other people will. What is the point, after all, in opposing modernity? Who are the people who oppose modernity? The people who oppose modernity see things which are distasteful. For example, very often I've heard it being said that when women are attacked, it is because they step out of home and do things that are not acceptable. Now, this is an example of anti-modernity, though it is happening contemporaneously, it's happening today. And because it's happening today, very often people think this to be an example of the downsides of modernity. That is not the case at all. In fact, I would say that because these things are happening today, there is this impulse from below which we must acknowledge. This is the inflection point that we must pay attention to, otherwise we will irreparably turn the clock back. Thank you very much.